Hello there, my name's Kyle Bloom, and today I'm doing a presentation for you on the diversity of the cattle industry around the world. Let's see here, this is myself with the cattle that I'm currently familiar with. What to expect as we go through this presentation. In this presentation, I've gathered up 8 different countries spanning across all of the continents that hold cattle on them. So that's to say everything except for Antarctica. And I went through and kind of done a bit of a breakdown on how their cattle industries work, kind of an idea of they're looking at. We're going to look at some of the particular breeds, some of the standouts for each country, along with kind of styles of production. How are they using these cattle? Are they using them just for dairy? Are they using them just for beef? Are they focusing more on utility breeds, or even still using their cattle as draft animals? And along with how are they using the land to take care of these animals. And then we're also going to cover the impact that each of these countries have on the global market. Are they adding into the global market? Are they benefiting from the global market from imports? Or are they adding to using their exports on both the beef and the dairy side? Let's first start with Nigeria. This is a country that definitely, if you would look at their numbers and look at how much they export, we will look at some graphs later on here towards the end of this presentation. But this is a country that produces over 321,000 tons of beef on their own, along with 526,000 tons of dairy, and exports very little bit. So they are not adding a lot to the global market. But when you go and look on their dairy side, they are actually benefiting from that. They are taking in from the global market. They import almost twice as much as they produce themselves at 927,000 pounds. And this comes from a lot of how once we look at the livestock they were using. So the couple of the bigger breeds that they focus on would be, as we got listed here, the white Fulani cattle and then the Nadama cattle. These are definitely two different types. Kind of both have their own purpose. The white Fulani that we have pictured here, you can see this big, obviously white. This would be what is called through the Bos Indicus or the Zebu Brahmin kind of sort of lines of breeds. This is the white Fulani is what actually makes up 37% of the national herd in Nigeria, um, and is pretty much a jack of all trades for them. They are using the Fulani, for what I understand, I mean, they are using it for a beef breed. They're using it for meat. They are the cows that are producing milk. They are milking those cows and making, whether you're just using the milk or making cheese, butter, whatever dairy products you would want. And these are also being used as draft animals. These are using plow the fields, haul produce, whatever they need to do. These are getting hooked up to wagons and plows and implements and doing what needs to get done. Common practice in the country, or starting to become more common as Nigeria is looking to try to be more productive on their own and is bringing Holsteins and crossing with these white Fulanis and trying to use that as a way to increase milk production while also breeding in some of the disease resistance that you get with some of their native breeds. And that is also a common use for the Nadani cattle, which is, I don't have a picture up on here, but is actually considered probably almost a dwarf animal. A lot considerably smaller than the white Fulani, which is probably one of the largest cattle breeds that you can find in Nigeria. And the Nadama's biggest use is for has some resistance to this uh, trypanosomiasis. Excuse me for my mispronunciations, but it is a parasitic disease that is spread by flies. It has a lot of big issues, such as anemia, fever, weight loss, and some edema issues. A lot of these issues then add up to having reduced conception rates and issues with reproduction, which is really not helpful, especially when you consider such as the animals like the white Fulani who are already late maturing when it comes to their reproductive cycles. They are not typically not ready to start reproducing until like 42 to 45 months. And to put it in perspective, um, about 16 months and older is kind of the window to start, if not even maybe a little younger for a lot of our breeds in the US with a lot of your European breeds. That is, yeah, anytime you are starting to lose out on any sort of production, any sort of reproduction issues, that is always not a fun time and always a big issue when you're raising livestock. Now we move on to South Africa. Definitely, when you take a look at numbers between Nigeria and South Africa, you see a lot bigger bump in overall production, both on the beef and the dairy side. But you also see a lot more of exporting and adding into the global market. South Africa, while they produce over 1 million tons of beef, they do export only 46,000 tons, which is about 5% of what they produce. And on their dairy side, though, they are producing 3.76 million tons of milk and milk products, while exporting 596,000 tons, or 16% of what they produce. Um, if we move down along here, one of the notable breeds that I wanted to kind of highlight on is the Naguni. Excuse my mispronunciation, but it's a native breed here. As you can see, really a pretty neat animal to look at here. But definitely is one of the biggest deals is also some of the disease resistance. Once again, disease resistance is a big deal with when you get into these animals, especially you get these Boston Indicus types as they're one of their biggest uh, come ups. And this is actually a native breed to South Africa and one of the very few, and is actually so treasured by South Africa that it is actually protected from exporting. They are not allowed to export these animals in order to keep their native herd as whole as possible. With this, though, this animal is also typically used in some of the females are then used in crossbreeding. Um, with the hides, like you can see the colors here, they're really pretty. So the hides are actually pretty sought after too, along with the meat. And so that is something. It's something that you don't typically see with a lot of other breeds. Is the desire to keep the hide. These are definitely earlier maturing than the previous white Fulani that we talked about, and just we see a lot of progress when we get to the Guinea. And then as we talk about South Africa and their types of produce, kind of how they do things, South Africa can kind of be broken down into three different types of producers. First, you have your major commercial beef production. That's your big operators, and this is primarily, if you know anything about kind of how South Africa's social social how South Africa is socially. The commercial beef production, which is these big operations, are mostly operated by for the white folk. While you also will see the next would be emerging black beef farmers who are going to be running on rented ground or ground that they're as some of the issues that have happened in the past are starting to be rectified and made right from what was done wrong. You're starting to see a lot more or of the black farmers be able to get opportunities and start renting and start these smaller operations. And finally, we also see some communal beef farmers, which are taking ground that is set aside for whole groups of smaller operations that want to come together and run their herds as one and take advantage of if they weren't able to, one person doesn't afford to get to afford a larger piece. You come together and make a, you would call it in the states here like a co-op style grazing. So that is definitely neat to see. Next, we move across over to Japan, which is definitely an interesting kind of country to look at when it comes to. It's not something up until recently isn't was not a place that one would think of when they think of cattle and beef production. Tonnage wise, not exactly the biggest. Like overall, they produced 491,000 tons of beef produced in the year 2022, with 11,000 tons of that being exported. And then in milk production, 7.6 million tons of milk production, with only 93,000 of that being exported. Excuse me. Probably the most uh, talked about and most well known breed would be Wagyu. I think at this point everyone has heard of Wagyu at some point. Wagyu is actually Japanese just for cattle of Japan or Japanese cattle. So there's actually the Wagyu is just kind of that term, and then there is different breeds. Like the most popular that I think everyone has known and everyone's seen as what we have pictured here is the Japanese black. That is the was typically being raised and fed out to make your A5 Wagyu steaks that are also wonderfully marbled. With these productions, we are seeing these are very slow growing, timely, meticulous operations typically. I mean, there are still some that are more commercial focused where they are going to be raising animals for not quite as high quality as, say, the Japanese, like Kobe farms, which are what the ones where they are taking all the absolute little details and making sure everything is absolutely perfect. Um, all the rations are right. Everything's growing right. There's nothing going wrong. But definitely something that is a point to talk about when it comes to how these Wagyu animals are raised is just the time it takes to raise and feed out these Wagyu animals. Typically 30 months from start to finish, or like 300 to 600 days, just depending. A lot of these operations are starting their calves out on grass and then growing them, and it gets to a point where the grass will not grow them. These are already a pretty slow growing animal, to where even if they wanted to do a true grass finished animal, they have to switch to grain grain fed situation to be more efficient. And that is also a focus that's going on more and more is how to as they go on they're trying to figure out while keeping the quality how to make these animals more efficient to get them closer to the rates that we see here in America with like the Angus, where you're putting on more pounds faster, you're converting your feed and be more efficient. Vietnam definitely was an interesting one. This is one I wanted to talk about because I think the Southeast Asia doesn't get enough attention when it comes to the livestock production, especially in the cattle. Um, Vietnam is probably not probably is definitely like our lowest producer for when it comes to beef production. That is at 331,200 pounds of beef produced by this Southeast Asian country. But actually do some exporting it. 19,000 tons of beef export, 6% of their production, but still quite a bit of it stays in for their own use. And they actually are importing quite a bit too, because while they're producing 331,000 tons, they also are importing 196,000. And then their milk production, they produce about 1.2 million tons, and then end up also importing another 2.7 million tons of dairy, which is amazing. They're importing almost between double and triple, like 2.5 times the amount that they actually already produce. And as we go on, probably the most notable and thought about breed when you think about Vietnam is the Vietnamese yellow cattle. This is definitely, as you can see in the picture here, probably one of this smaller stature livestock we'll talk about. It is a small native, but it is a native breed to Vietnam, and it makes up about 85% of the local population. Um, and as you can see, with it being that small, it is definitely not the most efficient. It is not the highest yielding. It is a very low yielding meat animal. They are primarily using this thing for these for draft animals, but are also crossing it. They will cross it with some other breeds, some other zebus to try to get things to be a little bit more efficient, or they will even cross the. They'll try to cross and figure something out. 45% of the national cattle herd in this country though is actually for draft animals. Their main production is their main use for these animals is to work fields and carry produce, like we talked about over in Nigeria with the whale. But also on top of that, when we looked at the milk production um, and seeing the numbers, especially you're thinking, okay, what the heck's going on if this is what they have for cattle? Um, Actually, 0.5% of the cattle population is actually Holstein Friesian dairy crosses, which is very interesting to think about. So still this little population, and to be able to be self-sufficient, or try to start being as self-sufficient as they can on their milk production. And then their how they kind of operate is definitely interesting. With they are just with how they are set up with their wetter seasons. They are in a tropical area. They are doing a lot more intensive style of feeding and grazing. So for their dairy stuff, they're doing a semi-intensive feeding system where they are collecting and feeding just kind of as going on as they need it. And then for their traditional cattle, they are using the intensive grazing systems. They're rotating around, moving from where they can wherever they can to get the best quality forage while they can. And then a common issue that they have in parts of Vietnam is they do go through less of the like cold and hot weather. They go through the wet season and the dry seasons. And the big issue they have is dry season hits and then all their forages are dry up. So a popular forage substitute that is used actually is a rice straw, which is a something that they can store as a byproduct of their rice production, which is a very important part of their of the egg production in Vietnam. So now we move to the United Kingdom, which is interesting in their own ways. 932,000 tons of beef produced, and then another 15.76 million tons of milk produced. So that was a number that really interested me. The United Kingdom, I feel like is synonymous for I not feel like it is synonymous for a number of breeds that have gone on to influence a lot of the world's breedings to this day. When you look at on the beef side, you have the Angus, you have the Herefords are the two probably two of the most prominent breeds to come out of uh, the United Kingdom, along with very notable and recognizable ones such as the um, Highlanders. Everyone's seen the big woolly shaggy things. And on the dairy side, the Ayrshire has played a huge role as a native English breed in the dairy side, as being very productive. And then there's also some other really good, interesting breeds that are very unique to the United Kingdom, such as the South Devon and the British White. British White is always something that will catch your eye as they're the full white with like the black nose and ears, and it's very characteristic to the United Kingdom. Some interesting kind of aspects to how the United Kingdom does their um, operates is with how the British climate works and how kind of how their seasons go through. They heavily depend on indoor housing for their cattle when their kind of colder, wetter season comes through. As that weather, cold and wet weather comes through, it saturates their pastures and paddocks, and it gets to the point where it's going to do more harm than good if they leave their animals there. So they depend on uh, using confinement, using barns to keep their animals in, keep them dry, and be able to keep them feeding, and just overall keep themselves, keep the animals, and keep the ground, the soil as healthy as possible. United Kingdom has definitely made some bold moves in the traceability aspect of the cattle industry, where they have systems where basically all every cow has their own passport that is tracked by the British Cattle Movement Service. So whether it's through an EID or however they go through doing it, they are able to follow from start to finish where that animal goes every step of the way. They're very on top of it. If there's any issues, they can trace it back and start connecting dots here and there and try to figure out where issues are before it gets out of hand and before it can get any worse and spread out any further. Then an interesting fact is of the 31 European of 30 across 31 different European countries that they were keeping track of each other. The United Kingdom was the fifth lowest in the use of farm antibiotics, is what they call it, with the only ones having lower usage being some of the Scandinavian countries. I just thought that was interesting, and Would be curious if that is something with their management styles or just access to what they have for antibiotics, or just kind of their thoughts and ideas on it. Here we are on to Australia, notably producing 1 point almost 1.9 million tons of beef itself produced, and then with over half of that being going to the export markets, typically to China and a lot of other Asian markets. Just coming out of their northern parts, it is very easy for them to send cattle out that way. And then they're even in their dairy, they're producing 8.45 million tons of dairy, with 2.3 million tons being exported, and that's roughly in the ballpark of 28% of their their milk being exported, which is just a, almost hard to wrap your head around just how much they're exporting. They are an exporting phenomenon. They are number three in they are the number three country in the world for exporting beef. And one of their kind of almost feels like a claim to fame is the amount of grass fed beef they do. They rely a lot on running out on bigger areas and utilizing all the ground that they can. That along with grain not being as accessible as maybe some of the other places, uh, like what we would see in like the United States. As we look in here, we can also see as you kind of take something to consider is there's sort of a split in how cattle industry works between the northern and southern parts of Australia. To go north, you see it's a lot almost drier. They're like what we mentioned with Vietnam. They don't have warm and cold seasons. They have wet and dry seasons. So this leads to more erratic stocking rates that where they have to depend on being able to run larger operations. Typically, they are the pioneers of gathering cattle with helicopters, doing their musters. They are running a lot of your Brahmin and Boston Indicus crosses, your Brahmins, your Brahmin Angus or your Brangus, your Braffords, your Santa Gratuitous, all of these different breeds with that Brahmin influence to help with the heat resistance and just a lot more ability to uh, forage and be as efficient as possible on less than ideal ground. As you get down into southern Australia, you get more into, I guess one would say, almost more of a temperate climate. You see a lot more of your British breeds. You're getting a lot more consistent moisture, so you get to see a lot more of these intensive grazing management programs where you're seeing a lot more kind of rotational grazing. Where up north you're seeing more extensive. They're kicking them out, give them all the ground they need, and then just give them all the space to spread out and try to hopefully not just completely mow everything down. And then along with that, as I mentioned, they're try to focus on like a majority of their cattle being grass fed. But in the year 2016 and the 2016-2017 year, only 35% of the adult cattle that were slaughtered in Australia were actually grain fed, which is an amazing thing to think about when you consider the amount of cattle, say in where we are in the where I am in the United States, that are grain finished. That just shows you how much of an emphasis they have on running on grass fed, and to where the point they get to the point where if they're looking at two different pastures and deciding the pasture with better grass is where they are going to put their feeding the cattle they are feeding to fatten up and to go to market, where the breeding stock will put down on the more marginal ground with the hopes that they should be able to still maintain them. They're more in a state of trying to just maintain themselves and just to get bred back. Australia has always been interesting to me. It's always interesting to think about. They're also very proud of the fact of how well they have their diseases under control. They do not have any foot and mouth disease there. Um, they have been brucellosis free since 1989, and then tuberculosis free since 1997, which is a feat that should not be overlooked and is pretty amazing. Next is Brazil as of 2022, and I think still to this day, they are the number one exporter of beef in the world, and then the number two producer of beef. They are producing 10.35 million tons while exporting 2.96 million tons of beef. And then their dairy on the dairy side, and they are producing impressive 35 million tons of dairy. Granted, they don't nearly contribute as much to the global market, or they're only exporting 207,000 tons. Not even 1% of their what they produce in dairy are they adding to the global market. Brazil is another place where they are typically they have a lot of the Zebu, Bos Indicus, Brahmin, whatever you would like to call it, influence. As you can see on here, the one of the biggest and most well known when you're thinking of Brazilian beef is the Nelore, which is these big white Brahmin, look like a Brahmin, but they are their own breed, a breed of their own, and they are typically there's a lot of this, and then a lot of the Brahmin, along with influence from your European breeds such as your Charolais and your Angus, to add Charolais for more terminal traits, and then the Angus for marbling and feed efficiency if you're in more areas with more abundant feed. Some interesting kind of how they like to run some of their systems is they depend a lot more on integrated crop and livestock systems, which they're working where the livestock and their crops are working in together, and along with some forestry. A big topic you always hear about when you hear Brazil and the cattle industry is deforestation. And there has been laws and regulations placed to remove as much deforestation as possible from happening in the name of cattle operations, producing cattle, and are now actually getting to a point where they are able to have forestation, actual like forestry work and the cattle industry work together, instead of having just have big grass pastures. They are actually able to work kind of in tandem where the cattle can come in and out and work within the trees. Some issues that we've seen have been talked about with the operations now as we get into wanting to be more sustainable in our practices is the socio-cultural barriers between traditional farmers and their established factors and the conflicts that that has with the sustainable intensifications. Some of the things that we're wanting to try and incorporate into operations as the idea of taking care of ourselves and the animals and the earth gets more and more important. And there's just some of these practices that are definitely a hard transition for the some of these producers on the smaller scale and more traditional side. That's just something that you they're starting to just work slowly at trying to integrate from one to the other. Finally, probably what I'm trying to keep the shortest here is the United States. We are the number one beef producer in the world, but we are just ahead of Brazil, but we are then number two in the exporting behind Brazil, with our beef production being at 12.9 million tons in the year 2022, with exports being at 1.7 million tons. And then our dairy production being at over 102 million tons of production, with only 4.5 million of that being exported. The United States, I mean, not a whole lot to, I guess, go. I mean, there is a lot, but it's not what I want to focus on too much. I would consider, a melting pot of cattle breeds. We take influence from all over the world. There seems to be new breeds just starting up every day of people taking crosses and trying to make them their own. And then that also goes along with the wide range of management styles across the United States. Things that, say, I do here in Southwest Minnesota are definitely going to be different than the guy that is running yearlings down in Oklahoma on wheatgrass this winter. And then the same goes, or vice versa. And then I'm definitely still also going to be different, much more different than the guy out on the East Coast, say in New Hampshire, who is running on a small, like, homestead style farm. There's with all the different climates and areas, different, how would I say it? Different traditions and different cultures, even just within our single country. You just see so many different ways. The emphasis on the kind of going in and out trends of grass fed or grain fed, different breeds. The Wagyu that we've talked about over from Japan has made its way over to the United States, and now there's operations that are crossing them in with their Angus breeds. There's guys that are focused on the purebred side of it things still. And then there's guys, your commercial guys, and it is just one big melting pot. In the right, anywhere in the country, there's no wrong way to do it as long as everything is healthy at the end of the day. Like I said before, just because it works where I'm at, it might not work down on the other side of the country there. And it's just always an interesting aspect when you talk about the USA, where, yeah, I could almost make a whole nother presentation on the different ways across our nation that people could raise cattle and could market them. The influx of direct to table marketing and just everything else that we've seen here. Finally, like I mentioned earlier, I've gathered up some charts, and you can kind of see here um, just where everyone ranks. The exporting is always neat for me to see because it gives you kind of an idea of how everyone's sitting. Like Brazil, you look over on their beef side and they're taking off. And then you look over here on the dairy side and they're just, they produce, then you look over up here and they're producing quite a bit. It's just a lot, to take in and look. And this is kind of where this is where all of our numbers came from that I was talking about earlier. In conclusion, we looked at 7 different countries across the world, and we had some similarities, we had some differences, definitely had some differences, and there is, at the end of the day, there's no right or wrong way. There is always going to be a better way, and we can only just try to keep progressing. Thank you for watching my presentation. Here's my citations for anyone that is interested in where I found my information. Thank you.